You're not pretending because you're fake. You're pretending because somewhere along the way, it actually felt safer than being fully seen. There's a moment, quiet but piercing, when you realize the version of you the world applauds is not quite the real one. And you might say things, wear the right layers, smile at the right time, and yet when you're alone, you feel like a guest in your own body. Not because you're a liar, but because somewhere you became fluent in performance, a look, a voice, a vibe that keeps you from being left behind. This isn't vanity, guys. This isn't deception. It's survival. Somewhere you learned that your fullness was too much, your softness was too inconvenient, and your truth too heavy to be loved without condition. So you edited bit by bit until the edits became your entire identity. But now something inside you is shifting. You feel it in the hollowness after applause, in the ache that no achievement seems to quiet. You're starting to miss yourself, the real you, the one who existed before the performance. This isn't a video about fakes or frauds. It's a slow, sacred unraveling of the poser archetype, why we pretend, who we're trying to protect, and what it costs to keep that act alive. Because posing, it's not just a habit, it's also heartbreak, a grief ritual in disguise, a self betrayal that started long before you ever logged online. It looked like being admired, but never really known. We'll explore why the world rewards masks, why your nervous system clings to approval like oxygen, and why reclaiming your real self might feel terrifying, but it is also the only way back to peace. If this stirs something in your chest, say, this isn't a reckoning, it's a return to the self you buried under all of that becoming. You don't need a new identity, you just need to remember who you were. What is posing, really? Posing is such a sharp word. It sounds like accusation, right? But what if we softened it? What if we said, this is what people do when they're afraid to be left behind or left out or left unseen? Posing, it's not about being fake, it's about being fractured. It's the art of assembling a self the world might choose, a self that's easier to digest, a self that gets a seat at the table, even if it means leaving parts of you outside the door. You've probably heard the classic examples. The girl in the band tee who's never heard the music, the influencer who speaks in borrowed captions, the woman who shapeshifts depending on who she's with. But posing goes deeper than outfits and Instagram. It's when you downplay your joy because someone else looks sad. It's when you overlaugh at a joke that stings. It's when you edit your truth in real time, hoping no one notices that tremble in your voice. That's not manipulation. That's memory. And your body remembers what it felt like to be too loud, too honest, too much. So it poses. Not why, but to stay safe. And here's what posing really is. It's protection dressed up as charisma. It's grief braided into confidence. It's the version of you who says, don't worry, I can be whoever you need me to be. Just don't leave me. Sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing it. The habits are so subtle. You quote someone instead of sharing your own thoughts, and you match the energy in the room, even when it contradicts your own. You talk in a way that feels cool, but sounds nothing like your soul. And when you do it long enough, the mask stops feeling like a mask and it starts to feel like second skin. You wake up one day and can't remember if you actually like what you posted. You question whether your smile was joy or reflex. You feel watched even when no one's around because the performance, it became internal. And here's the heartbreak. The longer you pose, the harder it is to feel real. You get the applause, the praise, the inclusion, but it never quite lands because it wasn't really you they were loving. It was your performance. And that's when posing becomes a slow kind of starvation of the spirit, of the truth, of belonging, because you cannot feel truly loved if the person being loved is only a fraction of you. So let's be clear. This isn't about shame. We all pose. We all adjust. We all ache to be chosen. But there's a sacred difference between sharing your light and dimming your flame just to fit the vibe. There's a cost to posing, not in popularity, but in peace. It chips away at your relationship with yourself, and that erosion is quiet but deep. This is not about calling yourself out. It's about calling yourself back to the version of you that didn't need polishing to feel valued, back to the softness you buried beneath the script. Because posing isn't a flaw, it's a flare, a signal that something in you still believes love must be earned. Let's listen to that signal, not to scold it, but to free it. Why we start performing. No one wakes up and decides to pose. We learn it slowly, softly, through glances, through silence, through reward. Sometimes it begins in girlhood. You notice how people smile wider when you're polite, how they praise you for being pretty, not powerful, how they applaud quietness and not questions. You learn quickly. Being agreeable gets love. Being soft gets protection. Being nice gets approval. And anything outside that script, anger, mess, opinion, wildness, gets labeled as too much. So you adapt. You tuck your truth beneath a prettier sentence. You hide your anger behind a curated calm. You get really good at sensing the mood of the room and then matching it. Some call it emotional intelligence, but sometimes it's emotional survival. Your nervous system wires itself around this feedback, and each time you're praised for being polished, a seed is planted in your head. This version of me is more lovable than the real one. And that's when performance begins, not on a stage, but in your everyday life. You start dressing for approval and not expression. You filter your words through the lens of, will they still want me if I say this? You mistake liability for belonging. And in a world that rewards the image more than the essence, you're told you're thriving when really you're shapeshifting to survive. Let's name a few of the roots that water this performance. Number one, fear of rejection. Beneath most posing is a simple aching truth. I don't think I'll be loved as I am. It comes from moments when your realness was met with discomfort, when your honesty made someone flinch, when your vulnerability was used as a weapon. So you pose, not because you're fake, but because your nervous system is trying to keep you safe. Because somewhere you learned that being seen was actually very dangerous. And performance became your armor. Number two, internalized performance culture. Especially for women, this is generational. We've been trained to self edit long before Instagram. Smile even if you're not okay. Be pleasant, not pointed. Hold your body like a question mark. Small, agreeable, pleasing. Performance has been sold to us as femininity, and when that's the script, authenticity starts to feel rebellious, risky, almost selfish. You might even notice how easily people receive you when you're being the nice version of yourself, and how the room changes when you tell the truth. It's hot in your head. There are consequences to honesty. So you start to assess every moment like a stage. What's safe to share here? What will keep me connected? And over time, you perform so smoothly, even you start to believe the character. Social media validation loops. Now, add algorithms to the mix. Platforms that reward curated perfection over human complexity. You post something real, it flops. You post something polished, it soars. Over time, your brain starts craving the dopamine of approval more than the groundedness of truth. And every time you get praised for the performance, it gets harder to come back to yourself. You might tell yourself, it's just branding. But what if it's more than that? What if your soul is exhausted from being branded? And then there's a slow erosion. You stop sharing the things you love unless they fit the feed. And you stop speaking freely unless it sounds smart, profound, poetic. You begin living for the caption, not the moment. That's not just social media fatigue. That's identity erosion. And it's so common, we've normalized it. Number four, loneliness and the ache for connection. Sometimes posing isn't even about impressing, it's about belonging. You shapeshift to be chosen. You echo opinions you don't quite believe just to stay close to someone. Because being left out feels like being left behind, and you'd rather be fake than be forgotten. But here's the catch. Posing doesn't lead to connection. It leads to attention, and attention without intimacy only deepens that ache. So the more you pose, the more unseen you feel because you start to believe if they really knew me, they'd leave. So we keep this act going, even when it's crushing you, because at least it gets you something. even if what it gets isn't peace. Number five, the fragmenting of identity. When you pose in too many places, you begin to forget who you are with the audience. You become a collection of impressions. You perform in work mode, in friend mode, in online mode, and eventually you start to wonder, where is the real me in all of this? That fragmentation is slow, subtle, but soul deep. And when you finally hear your real voice again, it sounds like a stranger and feels like a home you forgot you had. The grief hits in waves, not just for the time you lost pretending, but for how far you have had to stray just to be loved. But here's the sacred truth: you didn't fail. You adapted and you learned how to be what was expected because that's what kept you safe at the time. And even now, the parts of you that pose, they're still trying to protect you. So let's meet them with compassion. Let's not shame the performance. Let's listen to what it's trying to tell us because underneath every act is a question. Will I still be chosen if I stop pretending? And the healing begins when you start answering that question for yourself. Masking versus posing. Before we go further, we need to name something sacred. Not all performance is the same, and not every version of pretending is about being liked. There's a difference between posing and masking. And if you're neurodivergent, if you live with ADHD, autism, or another differently wired way of being, this distinction, it's not just intellectual, it's intimate. Posing is what we've talked about so far: the curated self, the borrowed voice, the polished persona crafted for approval. But masking is something else entirely. It doesn't come from a desire to impress, it comes from a deep need to survive. And many people who mask began early. You learned that your natural expressions, your stims, your hyperfocus, your blunt honesty were met with discomfort or punishment or isolation. So you began to study others, how they talked, how they moved. You built a script, a posture, a presentation, not to be liked, but just to be tolerated enough. Masking isn't about performance or praise, it's about suppression for peace. It's a quiet kind of survival, often invisible to those around you. People might call you high functioning because you've trained yourself to look like everyone else, but they don't see the cost, the exhaustion, the confusion, the grief of being applauded for someone you're not. Masking often leaves you feeling hollow, not because you want to lie, but because lying is the only way you found safety. And here's the heartbreak: you get so good at pretending to be okay that people stop asking how you really are. They believe the surface. You learn to resent the world for loving your mask more than your essence. But here's the sacred truth: people who mask aren't trying to be someone else. They're trying to make space for the person they already are in a world that refuses to slow down, soften, or understand. And too often, masking gets mistaken for posing. The awkward smile, the copied tone, the over explaining. From the outside, it can look like someone's being fake, but from the inside, it's a trauma response. This is why compassion matters and why we must stop rushing to judgment. Because if we don't understand someone's context, we risk mislabeling their survival as performance. So let's say this clearly: masking is not vanity. It is not attention seeking. It is not a lack of authenticity. It is a sacred strategy born of necessity. And if you are someone who masks, let this land gently. You are not broken. You are brilliant. You adapted in ways that kept you safe, in places that were never designed for you. And that's not failure. That's resilience. But just because masking helped you survive doesn't mean you have to live there forever. Unmasking takes time. It takes support. It takes the kind of love that doesn't ask you to shrink. And most importantly, it takes spaces that are slow enough, quiet enough, and kind enough to hold the truth of who you are. And you deserve that. Not someday, but now. Adapting versus abandoning self. Let's slow down for a moment because not every shift in behavior is a betrayal of self. Adapting is sacred. It's how we show up in different rooms with different people without losing who we are. It's an expression of emotional intelligence, not inauthenticity. You don't speak to your grandmother the way you speak to your best friend. You don't walk into a sacred circle with the same energy you bring to a music festival. That's not pretending. That's presence. That's context. But here's the difference: Adapting expands you, abandoning shrinks you. Adapting is fluid. It's knowing you contain multitudes and choosing which ones to bring forward with care. It feels like movement, alignment, flexibility with integrity. But abandoning, that feels like silence, like swallowing your truth, like shrinking to fit a space that was never made for your fullness. You start saying yes when your body means no, and you start laughing when your heart feels heavy. You nod along with things that feel untrue just to keep the peace. That's not you growing, that's you disappearing. And often it's so unstable, you don't notice until you are numb, until you hear your voice and wonder, is that really me? Until the mirror starts to feel like a stranger. Not because you changed, but because you edited so much, the real you went blurry. And here's a sacred checkpoint. When you adjust, ask, am I moving from love or from fear? Love says, I can meet this moment without losing myself. Fear says, if I don't become what they need, I'll lose them. Love adapts, fear abandons. And let's be honest, sometimes it's a little bit of both. And sometimes you start out adapting from love and slide quietly into fear. It's not always clear. That's why awareness matters more than protection. So let's not villainize adapting. We need that fluidity. We need the wisdom of shifting, but only if we're shifting with our roots still intact. Because here's the truth, you can be soft without dissolving. You can be flexible without fracturing, and you can evolve without evacuating who you are. There's nothing fake about being multifaceted, but there is a quiet grief in becoming invisible, especially to yourself. So ask gently, do I feel more or less like myself in this space? Would I feel this way if no one was watching? These aren't tests. They're doorways because real alignment doesn't require you to vanish. It invites you to arrive fully, wholly as you are. Why the world rewards posers. Here's the part that hurts the most. Sometimes the person who's pretending wins. They're the one telling the stories at the party. They're the ones with the perfect feed, the curated vibe, the language of belonging. They're magnetic, admired, and followed. And you wonder, what am I doing wrong? Why does pretending work? The truth? Because we live in a world that rewards performance more than presence, a culture that applauds image over integrity, that chooses charisma over complexity, that treats confidence, real or rehearsed, as currency. Posers are often skilled readers of the room. They know how to give people what they want, how to be the fantasy, how to play the part. And the world eats it up, not because it's deep, but because it's digestible, neat, branded, marketable. We've been trained to respond to polish. We trust the loudest voice in the room. We mistake certainty for truth. We reward what shines, even if it's hollow. So, of course, posers get picked. Of course, the mask gets rewarded. It's built to perform. But here's the heartbreak, what gets rewarded isn't always what's real, and what's real often goes unseen. You might be the woman who tells the truth quietly, who doesn't flatter, doesn't fake, doesn't filter, and you feel invisible. Not because you're not valuable, but because the world hasn't learned to sit with substance yet. And what about the ones who win by pretending? They get the applause, the invitations, the praise. But here's what no one sees, they are rarely at peace because they know deep down what's being loved isn't real. They smile for the cameras but crumble when they're alone. They gain followers but lose intimacy. They're celebrated but never truly seen. And that dissonance, it eats at you. It keeps you up at night wondering if you'll ever be safe to be known. And this is the paradox. Posing might help you rise, but it won't help you rest. Because attention can't nourish a soul that's starving for authenticity. So if you're feeling left behind while the posers rise, take heart. Your roots are deeper. Your truth is quieter, but it will outlast the performance. Because what's real doesn't need applause to matter. It just needs space to breathe. The inner cost of being a poser. There's a kind of loneliness no one warns you about. The loneliness of being praised for a version of yourself that isn't true. At first, it feels like safety. You're finally being seen. You're finally enough for them. But over time, the applause starts to echo. And the echo reminds you They're clapping for the mask. You feel loved, but not known. You feel chosen, but only on condition. And that's where the fracture deepens, because no matter how much approval you receive, it can't anchor you if it's not rooted in truth. You start to second guess your instincts. You wonder if your laughter is yours or rehearsed, and you forget what it feels like to speak without scripting. It's not just confusing, it's disorienting. Psychologists call this self alienation, when the version of you that moves through the world drifts so far from your essence, you feel like a guest in your own lines. It looks like success on the outside, but inside, it's grief because you spent so much time curating connection, you forgot how to experience it. And the longer you pose, the scarier it becomes to stop. You fear the real you won't be enough, that once the performance ends, the love will disappear. So you keep going even when it feels hollow, even when the compliments sting, even when your joy starts to fade, because the fear of being unseen is louder than the ache of pretending. But here's the sacred truth. If no one knows the real you, then no one can truly love you. And that's the cost of posing. Not just burnout, but isolation. You become visible everywhere and known nowhere. And eventually, even you forget what it feels like to be real. So, if you've been performing for so long you don't even remember your own voice, this is your reminder. The version of you behind the mask is not too much. She's just been waiting to come home, coming home to yourself. So, how do you begin to unpose? How do you come back to yourself after years of pretending? Not with a rebrand, not with a declaration, but with something quieter. You come home to yourself the same way you return to a long lost friend, gently, awkwardly, without expectation. You let her speak in small moments, you listen, and you trust she's still in there, even if you haven't heard her voice in a while. Start small. Notice when you catch yourself performing, not to shame it, but to soften it. Ask, what am I afraid would happen if I told the truth right now? That question alone is holy. It turns pretending into awareness. It opens the door. Coming home isn't dramatic. It's a ritual. It's choosing silence over spectacle, journaling before posting, sitting with discomfort instead of running from it. It's admitting, I'm not okay, or actually, I don't agree, or this isn't me anymore. These small truths are sacred threads. Follow them and surround yourself with people who welcome your full self, especially the messy, nonlinear, in process parts. Not just those who admire your light, but those who hold you when you dim. Because authenticity doesn't mean constant vulnerability, it means congruence. That who you are on the inside is allowed to match who you are on the outside. And this isn't about burning down your persona, it's remembering you were worthy before you ever built one. So here's your permission to post less and journal more, to tell the truth even when your voice shakes, to take off the mask. Slowly, safely, and in your own time. Because every time you choose your truth over your image, you make it easier for someone else to do the same. This isn't a glow up, it's a return, a sacred homecoming. You don't need to become someone new. You just need to remember someone who you used to be. And she's been waiting. This channel is all about leveling up, transformation, and making your life better for yourself and others. If you enjoyed this video, you might enjoy one of these two here.